cinematic structure, cinematic apparatus where everything in your films, from the ways that people are talking to one another, what's in the frame, how you're moving the camera, every single thing and element is operating from a particular idea. Often in your films, a particular criticism. I'm curious, in terms of the multiple levels that your films are working on. I'm curious how you see yourself within those levels, and also like how you do that. And yeah, I guess that's where I would like to begin. Yeah.
I guess how I would answer that is I've grown. I think I've always been this way. I'm a little hesitant in making films about myself in terms of their personal, but you take what you know and then you go from there. And then I think something that I've always attempted to do, and whether it's successful or not, is for others to judge. But what I always attempt to do is take where I've been and then begin to complicate it. I always want to complicate each thing because I do think cinema should be a question asking form. To me, it should invoke questioning of self, of community, of ideologies, of accepted narratives. So I say, how can I take each thing and then how can I keep peeling it and finding the under or the over or the hidden or the thing that's not willing to be discussed about an element. Like when I made Spit, I come from the hip hop community of New York, and I could have made a simple film for me that just about music and things like that. But I felt I had to ask myself, well, what is this about? What is this like really about? And then when I go through it, to me, I find out it's about a individual's relationship to being in neoliberalism. And like how do they function within that, and how neoliberalism is only going to produce for the most part, if people reject it on some emotional level, they're going to produce a zombie. So like I want it to be experiential, because then at the end of the day, if art is too information based or too content based, and it doesn't become an experience of where it's sensorily challenging you, then it's to me it becomes worthless. And that's where like I try to go and try to keep peeling or complicating each piece. And then where do I come in? This is sort of kind of go back to the beginning of your question, because I've been in those spaces, obviously for Whiteface, for instance, like, no, I've never really made the decisions that Charles has made, but I went to a classical acting training. I did that. The guy who played the actor was one of my teachers, actually. He was very nervous about doing the role. He was like, he kept asking me questions. It was really hilarious, actually. That's a side conversation. But I've experienced that. And I, instead of going, well, I got through it, like, no, I want to paint the complication of accepting any kind of status with that, with a certain, I don't know, conformity, and I wanted to be, and I wanted to present it that hardly, so then someone can say to me, "Nah, it's not that way," and then have that really strong discussion, right? Rather than tiptoe. I feel like tiptoeing is just not going to get us anywhere. I'm not sure that answered it.
No, I hear that, and I really like your use of the word peeling and complicating, because to me, in particular, upon first watch, and I'm sure some folks in the audience also kind of had this experience. To me, it's like you offer a critique and then you kind of critique the initial critique and it continues to unravel. And there's this quote, this is Martin Scorsese quote of like, a narrative, a good narrative is like, feels like you're peeling an orange.
Right.
And what's fascinating about that to me before I get to my question is like, that first criticism, I think a lot of people would be used to seeing on like a mainstream outlet, like in SNL or like even in Atlanta. Like I feel like a black man wearing a Trump suit is something that I would see on television from like a mainstream outlet. But then you like ossify it, and then you go further. You like continue to penetrate kind of the root cause. So I'm curious if you see your overall like filmography as like counterpoint to me. I mean, I guess it's like an obvious maybe answer,
like that word.
but like as a counterpoint to like mainstream media and also just
I mean, totally. I mean, like, so as I'm working though, I am thinking maybe not like specifically. I'm not specifically saying Mulder Malachi probably is the exception, but I'm not particularly saying, well, this is the way that they do it. Let me counteract it. I think with Spit and Whiteface, it was a process of an idea. Like Whiteface, I remember I had the idea, I saw the image, and then I had to ask myself, well, why is this image interesting to me? And then, like you said, I could stay with that and like write it in some kind of provocative way to get claps and laughs and provocateur points. But then I have to, any responsible artist will then ask themselves, well, why does this interest you? Right? And then the other thing that I could do is then like just condemn him for 21 minutes and go in this kind of like condemnation trail, right? Rather than say, no, this is the pernicious person he's become because of these structures. And then take it as an opportunity to look at the things that are happening within the social structures that make people make these kind of strange decisions. And then I think then you have interesting pieces that can actually like have utility. Those things who don't do that, or attempt to do that to me, they don't really have utility. They have the utility to get you famous or get you in, the conversation for, best short film award at Sundance Film Festival, and then you can go on to Hollywood and make, any big movie that you want, because they have to be surface level. They can't be a place where someone can look at themselves and honestly really question about even what they are doing. Like, what are you doing, or what are you a part of, or when I just kind of point my finger, and my like not going into the deeper kind of conversation around things. Yeah.
No, it's they don't have utility, and they also don't feel very sincere or
Right.
earnest. And I feel like that is a surprise out of like your work, or like there's like that quality of surprise. I mean, in terms of sincerity, like when I think about Mode of Malachi in particular,
Yeah.
there is this. The first time I watched it, and I wanted to like feel like how like the audience was responding to it the first time, because the first time I watched it, I did register. It was like cinematic recall. It was like I did register this like Ahmad Aubrey like parallel almost immediately, and then I was like, no, there's no way, because it was a bit. It's a bit like disorienting because I'm seeing these images that have been in my mind before, but it also has like the quality of a Nike like commercial. The way he's talking, he's like selling it. He's like selling this.
Glad you caught it.
Yeah. And like it was confusing, but it's confusing because your final point is so clear. Actually, there's like clarity there, and God, I hope I formed this into a question. I'm like what is like what how do you feel about working with like sensitive like images like that, especially since you are working with comedy. I mean, that is like a really like I would be very nervous to work with that, you know.
I think with Mold of Malachi in particular, I think I I felt that I was at a kind of a breaking point, that the images were so proliferating that like I had to make an intervention. And but I knew from my opinion, and others might disagree, the intervention had to be pointed, specific, and it couldn't be quiet, or I couldn't take the corner route, right? You know, I couldn't. Then I think I would be doing a disservice, and I felt it was really necessary to. Well, then we talked about this, to do a first indictment, right? So the first indictment is the idea of the viewer. Like I said, there's a pernicious pleasure that comes in people's pain and suffering, and we see it on social media consistently. We just see it, right? But then, and this is what probably got me in trouble with some people, was the back end, was the people who are willing to predicate their life on what do the whites like. That's their mantra. That's what their constant thoughts are. Whether they want to admit it or not. Yes, I do the didactic. I doubt there are people who are at home with, maybe though, people at home who have that seated up there. But look, I know enough people who work in Hollywood who've admitted to me in not so many words that it's in their brain. That is in their brain. And I see when maybe I give a note to a fellow person who works in the Hollywood structure saying, hey, you know what? My response to this piece you're doing is going to be, this is some really, really pernicious stuff that's only going to serve empire and the first cinema world. And they'll ignore my comment and take the comment from the person who, you know, runs Warner Brothers and says, you know, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we want, right? So they are, that thing is in their head. It is in their head. And, you know, the sensitive imagery, it's a, for me, cinema is a language. The way that you have to confront language sometimes is you have to speak the language, and then you have to subvert it, redirect it, and go from there. I'm not someone who particularly cares for violence in movies, but on the flip side, I felt that in a world of proliferation of it, how was I going to discuss it? And I had to kind of face it frontal, and then go from there and see. And I know it's funny that the part of my game with the movie was like I wanted people to honestly, for the first at least 4 to 5 minutes, be like not sure and like wonder like, did Mtume like lose it? And then they go, but then they go, you know, like so they kind of go. But then there's a self criticism because then like, you know, I worked in Hollywood, so I can't admit that maybe for a part of my life, what do the whites like? I sat there.
Right, and it also depends who's watching it. Like if they're gonna ask, did Mtume lose it? I mean, a lot of people probably would still wonder that based on the conclusion of the film.
Well, then, 100%, because then, you know, I did have a conversation with a few people who I know work in writers' rooms who seemed very offended by my assumption that they're participating in something that they need to question, and they wanted caveats. Well, it's not that simple. It's not that simple. I mean, I get it, but you know, and then it becomes kind of a non-starter, you know. And look, it's not like I said, it's not a condemnation thing as much as for me, it's, can we begin to talk about what we're doing? Can we like have a real conversation about what we're doing? Because like, you know, look, a lot of people like, look, I know actors, I know writers, I know a lot of folks, and you know, I always make this joke. I know some very famous people who call me when they're angry. when that executive like pissed them off and said that racist thing, they always want to call me. Man, shit, man, I love you. I miss you, man. Yeah, this racism out here is wild. And they always want to call me when they're angry about shit. And then when they're not angry, they forget I exist. Right? Or I gotta hit you up more. And that's the thing. So it's in their head.
Yeah.
They're thinking about this and they're confronting with it, but they don't want to have a conversation publicly.
No, that's a good point. And you're even right now you're saying like what we're doing, and I mean you perform in your films.
Yeah.
Which I think is like an important context for whomever like you're having this kind of like conversation or consternation with. And in terms of like performance, we talked about this a little bit before. There's this thing I'm trying to set it up. There's this thing when I was in film school, like this idea that theater actors do too much on screen. Like theater actors, that kind of checking. I was like, what's he playing? That theater actors overact. And it was kind of like endemic, and it was like pervasive throughout film school. Now we see this push in contemporary first cinema in Hollywood for like some kind of like faux realism. When I watch your films, they're very much again like providing a counterpoint to that. And I think about historically Black filmmakers from before, like Charles Burnett, the way Charles Burnett would use performance in this very like interesting theatrical way. Camille Billups would use performance in her documentary work to like her like family to like heal from trauma. Astemben, right, with like Hala and Mandabi, like that look like they're so funny, like the way that they use their actors for this more.
Mambete too, like Tukibuki, these very kind of large, archetypes. They're keep going.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. And what I'm curious about in 2024, I mean, all of these filmmakers are from movements, and from like community of filmmaking. Like they would talk to each other about the films that they're making. Do you think that the push on what do you think the push, I guess, on realism is, or being realistic? I know Bell Hooks has that essay that like, and in it says like Black people are obsessed with being realistic, or like keeping it real. Black people are obsessed with the real, and that was in a book that was in Real to Real, her collection of film criticisms. Yeah. So I'm just curious, like, what if you think, like, what do you think that is about?
I mean, I think there's a couple strains, and we could be here for a long time on this one. To be honest with you, but there's a couple of strains. I mean, some of it is I think is beyond just Black film. I think which you kind of stated, but I think there's a thing that kind of happened. I think around the 90s with acting, where there was a drive for kind of personality, and the idea that acting is a personality thing. And I think where the kind of the rise of how individuals and the regular individual, and I put these in quotations, became, I mean, it's funny. I named him in whiteface, but David Duchovny is one of those people.
Yeah.
This kind of idea of like kind of being able to be hip and quippy, right? Keanu Reevesy, and you admit he couldn't act, but he was personable, right? The kind of being able to kind of, and then the other thing that kind of happened is I think is actually very technical, it's very form. If you watch films have gotten less wide every decade. They get more and more. They go from wide to medium wide to predominantly medium to medium close to close. American movies are obsessed with the close up. As we become more individualists, we become also more obsessed with being right here, right? And it's connected also, I do think, to the kind of social structure of the me, the I'm an individual. Focus on the individual. Focus on the, which is interesting because if you go back to someone like Eisenstein said focusing too much on individuals in movies is actually counter-revolutionary. When he made October, you say you shouldn't actually do that. It's a problem with American movies. So maybe Eisenstein was smart, a little bit. He did a couple of really important things for cinema, right? Soviet guy. But you have all that, and then when you get to kind of, I think, as black movies, the thing is, black movies now, and I'm going to say something very, very probably controversial, but I don't think it's true, are not connected to the black cinematic tradition. They aren't. They're not borrowing from Watermelon Man. They're not borrowing from Chameleon Street. They're not borrowing from Ashes and Embers. They're not even borrowing from Mbete, Semben. They're not borrowing from it at all. They're borrowing from a Hollywood reference point. They're accepting, really honestly, what we talked about earlier, the neo-colonial reality. They're saying, you know what, Europeanism and European aesthetics are what cinema is, right? So we have to find a black aesthetics. That's why Clyde Taylor was very much against that.
Yeah.
He actually didn't buy the whole black aesthetics thing. He thought black aesthetics was just trying to take the European framework to create black creativity. And he says, no. You're messing up here. You're colonizing yourself, right, in that way. So, because if you look at the stuff from the 60s and the 70s, look at, I don't know if y'all seen Watermelon Man. I mean, that's what I was thinking about when I made Whiteface. I wanted, I gotta do that. I gotta go Van Peebles with it. I gotta go Chameleon Street. I gotta do what Wendell Harris was doing, because also our tradition of theatricality. I was looking at the people who inspired me, right? And like I said, the peeling back is stuff that they did. I mean, you watch Chameleon Street, that's not an easy movie to deal with.
Yeah.
That is not an easy movie to deal with. Every time I watch, damn, Wendell was digging. I don't really know. I was watching Emmy Tie by Sam Ben the other day. I was like, this is just a heavy movie to deal with. There's no easy answers, and I love that. And when you get into the Hollywood thing, you kind of go into that. So there's the obsession with this, with the individual is really high. And then I'll say this in closing. You can find a parallel between the kind of individualist social striving politics of the Black liberal class in not just the content, but in the form of the films you watch these days. The form. It's not just because, look, I agree, cutting out things and bad ideas is egregious in these movies, but literally the form and how it's delivered to you and how it's told you to make you feel, it doesn't make you ask real questions and it doesn't challenge you, right? And definitely doesn't want to liberate you. Yeah. So it's there. The evidence is there.
No, I agree, and that's why I wanted to open this in terms of just introducing the idea of structure.
Yeah.
Because like I said, everything, including your camera movements and what you're putting in the frame, feels like it's operating from your point and your point of view. Okay. So we're gonna move on to audience.
Like I said, we could do this for a long time. I know.
So if anybody has any thoughts, questions, or concerns,
concerns are fine too.
I have a lot of questions. I can't even think of which one I want to start with. But listen, the last point you made about sort of, I'm an untrained eye. I watch a lot of movies, but I don't know about.
Yeah.
But many of the things you're talking about is alien to me. What you just said about how things got sort of smaller, and wide. I would never pick up on that. You obviously would. Right? So the archetype of the black film, is it an archetype of black filmmakers, or is it an archetype of people who have been sort of subjugated, oppressed, the subaltern? Is that what it is? Or I'm trying to understand where where's the boundary between the present-day black filmmakers who are sort of adopting the sort of Western sort of ideals, and then the ones that you're saying are the black filmmakers. Where's that divide?
I mean, I think the divide is an intention and form. I mean, these are not just people who are making films. You said it. Chad said it. They're made in community and in conversation with each other. I recently I had the pleasure of spending the week with Charles Burnett, who made Killer of Sheep earlier this year. It was really a dream come true, to be honest with you. And he gave me his time, and it was wonderful. And I asked him something. I said, Charles, the one thing I need to know is how much were you in conversation with other black filmmakers around? He says, constant. He said, Bill Gunn and I hung out in France. We talked about films. We talked about it. He had the LA Rebellion with Garima and Julie Dash. This was a movement. So just like your political movements where they're sharing ideas, or your literary movements where they're sharing ideas, the filmmakers were doing exactly that too. And they had scholarship. They had, there are great essays, right? And then you had people who were the critics, like Deshombe Gabriel, right? Who was writing about the work, right? And documenting it. The sad thing is, they're kept out of film schools, right? Which is obvious. And there is, for multitude of reasons that I don't think I would want to get into. There's a multitude of reasons why there hasn't been a passing on. And the thing about film now is, people want to go to film, learn film, they go to film schools, and these film schools are European based. And even I mean, I teach at a film school, and one of my struggles I have every day, and I teach working class, middle class, and sometimes quite poor people to teach films, right? To do films, and they want to teach them these bourgeois aesthetics, and I'm like, they're never gonna make it. Like, what is your problem and approaches? So I say all this to say there is traditional training, just like any other forms, right? Art forms. Think of like your favorite literary or visual art movements. There is. Now for the audience, I mean, taste is not inherent, right? And it all has to be built. And I feel you. Like I have the same problem when I go see arts that I don't really know that well. My eye is not trained as well. But that's to me societally on purpose. They don't want people to have. I mean, Dr. Cherry Ball talks about this all the time about media literacy. Not to call you out right here, he talks about it all the time about they have a vested interest in you not having media literacy. It is true in having a particular kind of way of being able to look at media that helps them. That's kind of answer that.
Also, filmmakers today don't care about film as much.
This is true. This is true too. I mean, there's a constant drive. I don't know if you. I think we talked about this. That there's a constant drive to make them content creators, and to not make them filmmakers. Yeah.
Hi. So I was thinking about what you were talking about is like working in a collective, right?
Yeah.
And I think about, so I'm a visual artist. I belong to a collective, and I'm very productive because, of course, I can bounce ideas off the collective. Because I feel like I can pull everybody up, people can pull me up, and we're just striving together, and it makes the victory and the success more sweet when you have people who like roam with you, striving with you. So I had a mentor, Dorothy White. She was married to the late great Charles White, and she would have us at her house as a group of artists, and it was like kind of a salon situation. She said, all these jazz musicians would come and see my husband. I'm like, well, what did they do? She's like, they just sat there, chill, smoked a joint, and then they left. But she always said that he was with other people, whether they were other artists, musicians. It was like a collective. And, no matter how the Harlem Renaissance writers thing started, they still had each other depending on who was there, they still had each other, right? And we all associate them with other Black artists. Now, how it started, who funded it, okay, that's a whole nother story. However, we only associate Harlem Renaissance writers and artists with other Black writers and artists. So why I say that is now I was just watching the induction of Tribe Called Quest into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and I thought about Black Star. I thought about Wu-Tang. All these collectives, they came out together as groups, and then they broke up, and they have never been as famous, as successful, as conscious. Maybe most deaf to a certain extent, but however, I just feel like when you see all these girl groups back in the day, all these guy groups back in the day, now everybody's a solo artist, and I can say I have not heard anybody as great, as wonderful as when they were in that group experience. They're just, I don't listen to Beyonce. Don't come after me, Beehive. But I'm just saying, I think she was much better with the group than the individual. It's like kind of the century of the self. And so if you only have yourself telling you you're great, then really, how great are you really?
Yeah.
So I totally feel what you're saying about, this lack of collective, this lack of community with film. You see it across all kind of genres, and it's unfortunate because we are collective people.
Yeah, I mean,
we're losing so much.
Yeah, and I want to add one thing, and it wasn't just collective with artists. I mean, Sarah Baltimore, who did Zambizanga, was directly with the actual left-wing movement. She was with the fighters, right there. So, like, the political artists were political. Like, I was talking to some people about, jazz musicians who were passing notes for the Black Liberation Army. Like they would do stuff like that. I mean, this wasn't just like a thing we did our art and that's our politics and we go in a corner. Like, no, this was like a direct connection to the political movement, and they were learning from that. And then I was reading about like Ed Bullins and the great playwright Ed Bullins, who was also part of the Black Panthers and New Federal Theater. And Ed was saying, look, like I saw art as help cultural revolution, so the revolution can happen. They were directly connected. And that's why he also had his art level. When you read Ed Bullins' plays, that's some serious stuff. I mean, some serious questioning and serious wrestling. Because he was connected to the movement and not just in a way of just being like single-minded. He was trying to be complex and multifaceted. So yeah, I totally feel you. It has to be part of a collective and not just like other artists. That's kind of what, not just other artists. That's because I think that's another thing that's kind of happened with art. Art has become weirdly insular, more I think than any time. I think in this nation's history, I think artists are very, very insular. And it's something to think about, and it's something I've been trying to kind of challenge myself. 'Cause I used to do that. I'm not going to sit there and say I didn't do that for a long time, and maybe even on my worst days or on my most angry days, I don't want to just jump and say I'm going to be an artist anymore, But then I look at my material conditions and then I wonder.
Hi, so I just had a question about, I guess, kind of to piggyback off of what you were just saying. I'm curious to know like how biological family structures and systems versus created community kind of influence your work. Yeah.
That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, then I will have to go personal. I mean, I don't have any siblings, but I have siblings in this room. And, and people that I'm very close to who have helped me see. And I think in my work, in Whiteface and Spit, I was really concerned with the over emphasis on individuality and how this individuality and individualism will just create a false consciousness. And one of the things that I want to do in Whiteface, and I always hope it comes through, is that like every Black person that Charles encounters is extremely nice to him. right? And he can't take it. So because he's entered into this hyper individuality, he rejects community, right? And there is a way that I think, in many ways, we're even encouraged to reject community, and the helping hand in a real way. So, but then when it comes to like his sister, and then like the father in Spit too, I looked at that also as this kind of false consciousness that kind of happens in when you are over into your pride. Like another thing I try to do in my films is it's kind of what you were saying. It's like I try to have the person who's wrong also be a little right. Like his manager, he's right, but he's wrong about his approach. His approach to it. He is fundamentally correct. Like he's fundamentally correct about how it works. There's actually to be fundamentally nothing wrong. But his end is, well, then you gotta feed. You gotta be like everybody else. I agree with that. Right? And there's like those people who have the reads. And his father, he has a fundamentally good read, but then he lets the individualist pride dictate his decision making, which then gets passed on to his son, who then lets the individualist pride literally deny every other thing that's happening. So, yeah, in the end, but in my own personal experience, I think I would end up writing like this all the time. It's like I said, like I have family, but I also have family that's not family. So they're always going to permeate in how I see the world. And and probably at my worst moments, I have done that in my own version where I've discarded that. And I always want people to know that it's always going to lead you down the road. It's never going to lead you down a good
road. We're not okay. I kind of wanted. Is anybody else?
I think you have to.
Okay, never mind.
Mm-hmm.
Girl, I'm sorry. I'm eager.
I want to ask you what you think are the elements needed to transform a collection of individuals to a community. Because I think a lot of people think they have community because some of these artists you talk about, and I've met a lot of them, they know a lot of people, they have groups, and they might think they're in a community, they might even have the language of community, but it's like more like a mafia or a network.
Mafia is a good word. Yeah. What do they? I mean, look, that's a hard question because I haven't been able to achieve that myself. But if I mean, you can. I would mind you not. You can jump in too if you have any thoughts or anybody else in the room. Please, we're taking notes. I think my thought is first, like, what are the aims? Like, what do you actually want? Because the majority of art life is now about trying to get to a social position. It's been completely attached to raising your social status. Whether it's in your material conditions. Now, I'm not saying it's not valid. We all need to clothe ourselves, feed ourselves, feed our families. I got 10-month old, like, it's real. But then what becomes like the aims of what you want to do with the art that's beyond your own personal gains, right? So to me, it starts with kind of identifying what is art beyond your own, I guess, personal gain. And then when you go to that, when you get past that, then the next questions come about. And then a conversation happens in collection and you create some kind of forward movement. Now, how that works, I can only go by, I think, what people did in the past, that I think were successful. Things like, the Harlem version of the Black Arts Movement when they were up there doing stuff, various, arts movements around the world that were connected to various things. But yeah, it's a tough question. But I agree with your analysis though, 100%. Do I have the? I wish I did, and I'm trying to figure it out myself. But I would love to hear your thoughts.
I think with filmmakers in particularly, to Mtume's point about changing our aims, and I think because I think about this a lot within my own practice, I think filmmakers need to change how they're producing films, and understand that films don't need to cost that much money to make, and that also, I think. Hold on. We need to change how we're producing films. We need to change our aims and actually frankly, weed out the folks who see movies as business and as a means of raising their social capital. And I actually think something like that would happen naturally, if filmmakers are decide not to rely on big corporations and I guess grants or big grants, and all that for as ways to make their films. And I think it's also an audience thing as well. We need to build a film culture where people are engaging movies. I teach high school. I teach film to high schoolers, and this is my first year doing it, and I've been showing them older films, and they think black and white means it's an old film, not it's an artistic decision, right? They think they see things in certain ways because they were told to see movies as a certain way. And so I think it's about building a film culture. I think it's about guerrilla screenings. I think we've seen a lot of that during the the Antifada on like college campuses and stuff. There's been a lot of guerrilla screenings, for like revolutionary cinema, for educational purposes. And I think there needs to be more of that, more regularly, outside of times of crises. And it needs to be it needs to be a full effort, not just filmmakers, but audience people, organizers, because this is our media as well. Film is a way for people to learn, a way for people to see themselves and see their relationships with each other and the world. So it's very important, and I think that's just the first step. We have to disengage with what is being put in front of our faces 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Do one last question. We'll give you all a chance to wrap up.
Cool.
I just want to connect it because I feel like y'all are talking a lot about obviously cinema, right?
Yeah.
And then like art in general. But all those questions and all those challenges, I feel like are reflected in every parts of us everywhere, like in our own identities, right? Like really what you're talking about is like how we function in a capitalist white supremacist world, right? And so it's like this, I'm an educator, I'm a social worker. The same thing is like, how do we do that work, and why? It's like the question of like, why am I doing that work, right? Am I like teaching because I want people to like get A's, or am I teaching because I want people to be liberated? You know what I'm saying? And so like, I think it all comes back to, and like in our mainstream society, everything is there to continue the status quo of capitalism, white supremacy, and all of that. And so anything that you're doing that is in all, I guess it's just like that same question of like, how do we build community? How do we do all of these things? Like, how do we break that? You know, it's like every freaking space. It's not like it's in cinema, and it's just ubiquitous. Thank you, best friends.
No, thank you. I agree with that, and I think spaces like this, like Making Worlds Bookstore, who has a lot of great programming as well as this, these kinds of screenings, like this helps, right? Because now you guys are going to go out and tell your friends that Mtume Gant has a film coming out, and it's going to be crazy. And he's a great filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the last things I'll say is, and I'll make it brief. I mean, you want to get, going. But I 3 years ago, I taught a class called Cinema and Revolution, and it was a class based on kind of studying the social movements of, leftist cinema. Starting from like Eisenstein's October, going all the way to things like, the Red Detachment movement in China. We went backward to the, third cinema movement in Latin America, Africa. And one of the interesting things that I discovered that happened, I didn't know this, was a lot of those movements were very much in conversation with each other. And they did some wild things. I had read about they wanted to in China during the war, during the revolution. The Soviets would airdrop revolutionary films that they could watch, and they would set up private screens and go watch stuff. Same thing when the Cuban filmmakers went to Vietnam and did a Third World War. If you've never seen that film, that's a phenomenal film. Better than any Vietnam movie you'll see about America. But they went there and they made these movies, and then they would take them and they would screen them across the world, and sending canisters and shipping them, and it was this movement of making really alive work. And I'm gonna tell you, cinema is just as great as your favorite movie. This idea that it's somehow lesser, is ridiculous. Or then someone like Boba Roca, who is like, you know what, I'm gonna go to Africa and make The Lion Has Seven Heads because there needs to be a film that is about the African Revolution that's happening. And I'm gonna have African people involved. I'm gonna do this stuff, and we're gonna do this and create this. And then him screening it in any way he could, because he knew by that point he had to realize the big film festivals were a sham, but he was bringing it out. So it's just really to piggyback on your point that it is a precedent, and these are artists who, to me, if you watch, there's no way you can watch a Global Roca film like Black Guy White Devil and not be like, yo, this is as dope as anything you've seen on any level. To me, doper, because he's not just working. He's not just working in singular ways. He's working on multiple levels, trying to liberate you as you watch it, or push you toward liberating yourself. Actually,
Beautiful. Thank you, everybody.
yeah, I appreciate you very much. And thank you, Mr. World. I really appreciate it. Sure.